It's all
The owl should be on that computer, and then that one should be muted.
my computer hates Zoom. Everything's muted on it.
What if we
everything's
just turn the actual volume?
It's muted. Every other my computer's muted.
If you turn the volume.
Good.
Zoom world. Things about the meeting process overall. So we have talked in the past couple of meetings about just your roles as board members. And one of the things that we really appreciate now more than ever is you all playing that translation role between your networks, constituents, your community, and this task force, and going back and forth. So starting now, awesome.
It's just my computer hates Zoom.
Starting now, we're gonna ask you all to go back and forth with bringing the input that you hear in the community back here to the task force, and then taking information from the task force. Here's what people are considering, what do you think, and bringing it back. So that's one thing, just to start emphasizing more and more to you all. And the second is, at this point, we've articulated a set of guiding principles as a task force. And so for you all to just be wearing the hat of the entire community, the entire task force, there are a lot of interests that we need to meet collaboratively for this ordinance to work and for the recommendations to pass. And so just asking you to wear that collective problem solving hat as well. So that's great. Those are the two things I wanted to say. I think in terms of Zoom, we've gone through hopefully the hardest part. And now we are going to have a couple of breakout groups during today's meeting. And when we go into breakout groups, we're going to have 3 or 4 groups meet here in the rooms, and then we're going to have a breakout group online. Sophia Blanca from CBI is going to facilitate that, and she's going to watch the chat. So folks online, please feel free to put notes in the chat. Sophia will track it, and we'll get your comments inputted into the room. So I think with that, any questions on agenda, topics, things you were wondering about, housekeeping, anything like that? Restrooms, women's is here, men's is around the hall.
There's a kitchenette back there for water.
We will take a 5-10 minute break at some point halfway through. Good? Okay. Thank you for bearing with us. So Blake, I'm gonna pass to you to take a deep breath and dive in.
No, I'm a little stressed out.
Yeah.
Okay. And now, so Anna, the last glitch is you have to advance the slides for the people on Zoom. I'm no longer in the Zoom. So are you on the slide?
And I should say we haven't introduced city staff, but thank you so much, city staff, those in the room, those online. We really appreciate you being here. You're part of the connective tissue of all of this.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna advance to the next slide. So this should be familiar for everyone here in the room. This is just our standard timeline. The start is where we are today. So we've already had 2 whole meetings. And a lot of you have been meeting in small working groups in between, and we appreciate that. So today our meeting is focused on, we're gonna spend some time talking about equity in the context of waste no more. And, you know, how to make sure that under-resourced communities and buildings are not only able to comply and benefit, but also not harmed by anything we do with this policy. Then we're also going to shift and talk about supports and incentives. And then actually, we're going to end today with talking about what is our process for actually getting the recommendation. And to get us started in that conversation, we actually have a draft I want to share with you. We will not be asking for any decisions today. It is just to introduce the concept of how we will go through this process to see if it works for everything. Oh, you know what? I just really already covered this. I figured this is, again, this is a recurring slide that we have highlighted is what we're talking about today. So just to recap, just make sure that we're all on the same page of what we talked about in April. So we talked about what are the current realities. We heard from a number of different of our stakeholder representatives here on what the market's like, what's it like really implementing recycling and composting programs in our buildings. We set up our guiding or agreed on our guiding principles, which again, you don't want to hear me read through a slide. But you know, again, recognizing the will of the voters, number 1, keeping that squarely in our minds, and making sure that this work, everything that we come up with in this policy is feasible and implementable. We actually started talking about some rollout options and trying to put some structure to how we think about all these different choices that we have to make. We didn't make any decisions on that, but again, it was introducing the idea of, you know, how do we go through this process in a logical way and in a way that we also are considering all the different factors that go into the decision making. And then we began our working groups, and they met, in between meetings.
And Grace, one thing I might mention is that we did pretty much, I think you all unanimously talked about how you really felt that we weren't just updating deadlines here, we were wanting to be a little more strategic. So we're somewhere between B and C, doing some strategic thinking in the work groups about how this rollout can happen in a way that's gonna be most successful. Sonia?
Oh, never mind. I see it on the agenda. So we're gonna get all of the work group updates today, not
Yeah,
just the
yeah.
one work group. Okay.
All
Oh, yeah.
the work groups, yeah, who have met. Yeah,
Oh, okay. I guess
You can come back to it.
Erica's slide, I know she wasn't able to be here today, so I think this is just a reminder, this is what the ordinance currently recommends, but again, as you just said, we know that we're not simply updating the timeline, we're gonna be doing more of that, okay? So actually, that was just our April recap, we wanted to keep that short, just make sure we didn't forget anything.
I think we're good. So does anyone have any, like, are we up to speed? Everyone remember what we did in April? And because now what we want to do is hear from all the work groups, which the work groups met once or twice, 3 of them met. 4 of the work groups met once or twice in the last month since we all met. And they basically took what you all had offered in terms of high level guidance about, here's what we think about the rollout of this ordinance. In ways that stick closely as possible to the will of the voters, but also are strategic to make sure we're successful. And they just drilled down into more specifics. And so we're gonna hear from each of them, each of the groups in terms of what they talked about specifically with respect to what's in the ordinance and what will go into the rules and regs or the ordinance language. And also we'll hear from them on what else they talked about in terms of what supports are necessary to make this work. What are some equity considerations? So I think with that, we'll.
Okay. Van,
So one quick thing, I talked to Grace, you and I had a conversation that I think was very helpful with my understanding of.
we're gonna do that later.
Okay, well, I was gonna talk about that whatever we end up voting on in the end isn't going to be the only thing, like everything that we're discussing regarding equity, et cetera, isn't going to necessarily just be implemented into what we vote on, but will also be put into a list of guidelines for separate. And I think that was really helpful for me and others too.
And Van, that comment in your conversation with Grace led us to do some thinking about how to make that super clear in today's meeting. So thanks for that conversation, and you'll see that it leads into some.
Our conversation turned into like 5 slides,
Oh, right.
so there's a whole section on it. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so what we wanted to do is just turn to the work groups, and first we're gonna hear about, their suggestions at this point. What are they talking about in terms of the phasing of the rollout? What other suggestions are they thinking about in terms of other pieces of the ordinance language and the requirements? And then we're gonna hear about what they said about equity and supports and incentives in more detail later in the meeting. But, so you can advance, are you advancing or are you?
No, well, we're both advancing. She's doing it for the people online. I'm only with the people in the room.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we're turning to so whoever from the work groups is giving the update for your group. For licensees, is that Rose? Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.
You know what, and whoever's speaking should definitely come closer, especially for staff. Wherever you want to stand is fine, whether you want to come up front or stand in the middle.
I'll just stand here because I'm.
And so, of course, like every normal PowerPoint, we started out with a report out, like a slide for each group. And then we decided it actually made more sense to go by categories that were discussed, since that was uniform throughout each group. So everybody's going to be teaming up together to discuss these issues, right? And are you covering licensees and buildings?
No.
Who is,
I think
who is
Peggy.
Oh,
I think they might be
you
her.
can see Peggy online.
Was it anybody in the room that was in the buildings work group that can report out? I think Peggy and Steven and Brendan, you weren't there.
Peggy's raising her
But I
hand.
think Peggy was planning to
Okay,
say.
can you ask Peggy if she'll be able to come off mute to, Peggy, I don't know if you can hear me. If you're able to come off.
I can hear you.
Help report out for the buildings group.
Okay, so,
So I'll start with licensees and event holders. I have the notes from the buildings group, so if I need to refer to that, I can. But something we talked about, for licensees and event holders, possibly tailoring the phasing to require compliance for back of house operations before front of house compliance. And or delineate responsibilities more specifically. For example, the food licensees in the shopping mall should be responsible for their kitchen, with the shopping mall operator or building owner being responsible for visitors throughout. Another idea for phasing and grouping is to differentiate between vendors offering on-site consumption versus to-go options, because we were discussing that in a number of cases, the waste that's being generated by a business may not be disposed of at that business. For those that were in my work group, is there anything that I missed regarding phasing and rollout? Want to add? No? Okay. I'll just read for the room and the group, for the buildings. Support for phasing in requirements for apartments based on units. However, there may be room to simplify or clarify. For example, roll out in 2 groups rather than 3. Clarify whether units are at one location. And then openness to considering phasing beyond, or sorry, based on tonnage, if that's more equitable or efficient for achieving waste and more goals, instead of phasing per square footage. I don't see Blake in the room, but he had some thoughts on that. So as we continue to discuss that, I think he'll play it. And then you were C&D?
Yeah, so on behalf of the C&D working group, we are spending a lot of time getting to know what other cities are doing when it comes to C&D ordinances. And so right now with the phasing, there isn't really any phasing language in the ordinance as is. So we've been talking about phasing options related to building age. We've heard that from other cities, and then also looking at residential versus commercial, if one needs to come before the other. So no conclusions there, but very much ongoing conversations.
Yep, and a reminder, C&D, construction and demolition are construction.
Yeah.
Peggy, I don't know if you're off mute and wanna, do you wanna add anything, Peggy, to the building report out?
yeah, so can you hear me okay, first of all?
She's trying to talk, so I don't know.
Is yours not muted? She's not muted.
I'm not muted.
Oh, there.
Yeah, so it's not.
So do you get, because earlier I saw that it was muted. Is everything unmuted? Your thing should be unmuted the whole time. Okay.
Go ahead, let her talk and see how we do.
Taylor, you might have to you might have to.
Everybody just has to be really quiet. Go ahead.
All right, go ahead, Peggy.
Can you hear me okay? Sort of.
Go ahead.
Okay, I don't know if anyone can hear me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give it a try. So the number of the things that we talked about have already been stated really well. There was another part though that regarding the phasing for rollout for multifamily and some of the other providers that we thought basing it on licensing that's already in place to try and keep it simple. And something that kept coming up in our conversations were simplicity and being very clear and providing definitions. So to the simplicity point, if there's licensing that's already in place, then that could be a great starting point for us rather than creating yet another swim lane or set of swim lanes for people who have to comply. And bringing it down based on unit count from 3 different categories to 2, which would be 8 to 100 units and then 100 units plus. And we thought that maybe the 8 units was on the small side anyway, so maybe we bumped that number up. There were a few ideas like that, but it's really responsive to what we're seeing out there. And again, keeping it very simple. We thought also that offering exemptions for smaller owners with very slim margins or groups that need a longer compliance time or time to begin complying, that we could have some sort of formula or metrics so that people can apply for that and you know, if they prove need, then we're nimble enough to accommodate that.
And so, Peggy, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so thank you. And actually, I think we're gonna advance to the next slide because I think you're getting to the next slide, but one, so Anna, you can advance to the next slide because I think we wanted to hear from the work groups about not just what you're talking about in terms of the phasing and rollout, but what about other parts of the ordinance? The thing I wanted to say is we're gonna get to this later in the meeting in terms of how do we take all these discussions and get them into some draft recommendations for you all to consider as a full task force, because everything has to be voted on by it has to be approved by the task force. One of the things that's gonna happen is that you all are gonna take a hard look at a number of criteria, and Grace is gonna walk you through that at the end, to make sure, is this recommendation consistent with the will of the voters and with the ordinance? Is this recommendation feasible? Is it equitable? Like a number, lots of, right, and staff is gonna help go through that process with the work groups and then with you all. So there are gonna be some ways to translate what you all are talking about into recommendations that are consistent with the guiding principles of this whole task force. So I just wanted to reiterate that piece, and Josh, you kind of gonna.
Yeah, I was looking at, listening to the discussion on the phase out, phase in. I think one of the things that should be heavily considered as well is grace period, as well as hardship clause in it as well, right? Because everybody in the state or is not necessarily in a position to rapid or fast changes, and there could be some type of equity there for those folks as well, so that they can stay in business and not.
And
So rest assured, we're actually gonna be going into small group discussions about a lot of this, and just after we get through it.
yeah, specifically with a focus on equity and specifically with focus on what other support does everyone need? Yeah.
Are we also gonna, I know we touched upon this at the first meeting, I don't recall if we did at the last meeting, but the fact that, like I talked to several restaurateurs between the last meeting and this meeting who have said that they used to have recycling, composting and trash. And now they're both, the recycling and composting went away because their companies weren't able to do that anymore. So at some point, are we gonna address, I think in detail, what, do we even have the infrastructure, or what does that look like? And how do we need to get the infrastructure to even be able to make this feasible in the first place? Because I talked to just out of 4 restaurants, 2 of them off the bat that were doing composting said they were dropped, that their companies don't even offer that anymore. One of them said like 3 different composting companies dropped them because they just couldn't do it.
Yes, so yes, I think that when we have the more detailed discussions about the phasing and rollout, which we're going to start, we're gonna head towards that at the end of today. That's where that kind of discussion happens, because again, as I've said before, from a city perspective, we want an ordinance to be fairly timeless. Because we don't want to have to keep going back to city council every time the market shifts and said, okay, they can do compost now, so we want to come back and write that in. So we want to have some flexibility in terms of accommodating the market, but the rule is still there. And so it is the nitty-gritty that we have to get into. So yes, we will have that discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so how about just a quick recap from the rest of you? I think we heard from Peggy on what the buildings folks talked about in terms of other parts of the ordinance, but do you all want to talk about your first?
Yeah, I'll go because we were similar in the line of thinking of like aligning with existing licenses and trying to keep those channels clear and not convolute or complicate things further. So the group liked the idea of delineating responsibilities in line with existing city practices and programs like food licensure or specific permits that would trigger a certain responsibility. For example, permitted events. Right now it's a little too broad. There's a lot of different style events, and we'll talk about that later and defining what that means. Also, there's currently overlap on the compostable compostable waste producers list in the ordinance. So there may be opportunity to refine the operators and responsibilities. And then, yeah, I think Peggy kind of talked a little bit about buildings, but maybe wants to expand on that some more.
I think she spoke pretty directly to these 2 bullets, and Peggy, please chime in if you want to say anything more. But Jessica, in the meantime, do you want to talk about P&D for a second?
Sure, so something that we'd like to clarify on the C and D part of this is that there are two types of permits that we're talking about. They're different, one's for construction, one's for demolition, and that needs to be called out more clearly. Also needing some sort of definition or a new way to describe readily recyclable. There isn't currently one. And then we've been discussing as a group and learning from other cities on deposit systems. So when you apply for your permit, you also put down a deposit based on how much you're going to recycle on your site. And if you don't recycle all of that, then you don't get your full deposit back, basically, to incentivize compliance. And then we also just said responsibilities wise, probably Department of Transportation Infrastructure shouldn't be the ones reviewing recycling and reuse plans for C&D projects.
Yeah, Josh.
Thought that was a great idea. And I think, if you close out after the job is done, it gives you a lot more wiggle room with how you implement it, and it allows for you to have teeth in some of these policies. So when the contractor is done with the job and he's closing that job out and taking that permit back, he needs to take back with him receipts from the recycling centers of all the waste that they had on those jobs and what they did with that waste. And based off of that receipt or not having that receipt is where your line
That's
comes into
certainly
place.
the type of model that we're looking at.
And
Yeah.
Josh, did you sign up for, you should be on the C and D work group if you're not already. You don't have enough time in your life, but
I'm gonna make time,
after this meeting, can we connect about using you and the workers?
yes,
Okay.
yeah. I think also if we did it that way, what it will also do is like, so I'm in roofing and exteriors contractor. And what companies will do is they'll find a nice mom and pop. They'll be doing that home and they will purposely over order materials and things like that, which they can charge to that particular job. Right? Make their money off of it, and either have excess inventory or it's just waste. If they were being taxed on the back end, it would stop that entire practice, right? Because now I know I'm gonna have to recycle this amount of waste based on what I ordered. And I know I'm gonna get taxed if I don't on the back end of that. So when I'm ordering, I'm gonna order specifically to the job. I'm gonna short order instead of extend that order out. Because I don't want to show you guys how much waste I'm gonna have to actually recycle. The secondary effect of that is like there are homeowners out there who are now no longer getting scammed based on this policy.
Josh, that's exactly why we want you in the workroom.
You know. Oh, no. Josh, the reason why it's important too is just process wise, like, part of what we're gonna do, and we'll talk about this at the end of the meeting, is have you all as a task force provide high level guidance to the workers, the work groups. We really are gonna you are all tasked with getting into nitty gritty, coming up with options, coming up with specific proposals to bring back to this group based on the guidance that you all offered, which you have offered through your guiding principles among other things. And so we need you and anyone who has expertise in a particular area in those work groups to help, because especially for the next month, you're gonna be fleshing out a lot of ideas and options to come back in June with. So anyway, process wise, that's the idea, but thank you for kind of illuminating that point.
Which we go over that.
Yeah, and I was just making sure that Anna's able to take notes of all of these comments while also doing the multitasking. So maybe between Taylor and Anna, we can just figure out the tech.
Okay. And again, right now, we're really just trying to report out. We are gonna be breaking into small groups where we can get into more detail. So. Back to Rose and Jessica.
And then, you all talked about supports and incentives. Let's not even talk about these after you all give a quick thumbnail sketch of what you talked about, because we're gonna talk about these specifically in the small groups. So just like give us a snapshot of what you talked about, and then keep this in your minds for when you meet small groups.
Okay, so for licensees and event holders, we discussed city-funded access to bins for one-off uses, either through city rental program or grant funding for organizations. There's a lot of really small community events that only happen once a year. They're not a event planning organization that do multiple events throughout the year, so that would be less cost prohibitive for them than purchasing their own. City provided best practices and guidance for community events that want to comply but aren't required to under the ordinance, like the neighborhood block party or a picnic in the park or a family reunion, things like that. Because it was emphasized that a lot of this change and social change happens in our communities and small discussions. So we want to make sure that we're providing guidance for them, even if they're not required. Recognition or incentives to achieve compliance early or go above and beyond minimum standards. And then we also had talked about, and I don't know if it's under buildings, maybe it is, but yeah, shared resources for space limitations. So I guess that's a good segue into buildings.
Heidi, do you want to say a couple words about buildings and what you talked about?
I do, and I have to say, this was where we produced our best conversations. I think maybe that was true for everyone, but it was for sure true for our group. So regarding support and incentives, there's a lot of conversation on the user end of all of this and who is actually doing the recycling and so on. But we think that there should be uniform standards also for haulers, that if there's more clarification there and very specific standards, that would simplify things for the entire process and not to exclude the user end of that too. Manufacturers, we need to have the manufacturing community get more involved with using recyclable materials and being smarter from that side too. Education for youth. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what that includes, but we need to continue on with that and have that younger generation always be thinking in these terms and not have it so much as a learning curve. We think that the signage should be standardized and colors, the three, trash, compost, recycle, having them in the same order in every venue in which they're placed so that it's just so identifiable, the consistency there, and again, keeping it very simple. For posters, we think that there should possibly be mandatory posters, and again, having those very consistent. And if you think of what employment posters look like and how they're required, maybe we model it after that. These are ideas too. And for smaller businesses that maybe have shared spaces in one way or another, but maybe they can have shared bins and a shared infrastructure. So I think these are all ways that we can support and then provide these additional incentives.
Great. And just a reminder, there is a whole work group that's going to be engaging on signage education and using these comments as part of what they do. Cindy?
Yeah, so based on what we hear from other cities, a certified deconstruction contractor training program is something that other people have been successful with. So asking the city to look at that option. Also, the work group was asking for city support in just the increased education and awareness around what C&D recycling really entails through, however events, training. And then also similar to the other groups, encourage alignment across regionally, really, if you think about contractors who have to report these things in different cities. So with recycling reuse plans and also reporting.
Okay, so that's just a snippet for everybody about what the work groups are up to. There's going to be more meetings over the next month. They will come to you in June with some concrete ideas in the form of recommendations for you all to refine and approve or send them back to work on some more. Any other questions, high level, before we get into the sort of equity deep dive of this meeting? The work groups. Good. And
We're looking at Anna and Taylor to make sure no one's raising their hand online.
okay, thank you. And in terms of this next, okay, so we're gonna segue. The equity work group met, you all discussed, you'll hear from the work group about what they discussed, but the idea here is that we want you to hear from the work group about what they discussed in terms of who needs to benefit, and really be looked out for and not be harmed. And how do we determine who those buildings, neighborhoods, communities are? How do we make sure that equity is considered in an integrated way throughout this process in all recommendations? And then how, what kinds of programs are going to be helpful to make that happen? And so we've been thinking about process, and we've been thinking about who, and then we've been thinking about supports and incentives. So you're gonna hear from Grace and hear from Marguerite, and then we're gonna go into small groups to talk about like what really resonates for you, what's missing, what else is important to call out here. So
Great, thanks. And Ryan was also in the meeting. Van was there for a little bit. And then Luis was there, and he wasn't able to be here today, but his proxy's online. So I'm gonna start first with especially for those of you who are new to this process and haven't been through a city of Denver task force before. I want you to know that we have an Office of Social Equity and Innovation that really guides all city agencies in how we incorporate equity into everything that we do. And so all the city staff, we've all gone through a lot of training on this. It's been a long conversation over a period of years. And of course, our agency, we really came of age. We began in 2020, during the racial reckoning that the whole nation went through. And of course, we saw what happened to our most vulnerable communities during COVID as well. And so embedding these concepts into our work for us now, it's always work, but it does come fairly naturally. We do always do it, but it isn't always familiar territory to everybody. And so we want to give each other patience, give each other grace as we go through this conversation. But I at least wanted to start by giving you this overview of how OSEI, the Office of Social Equity and Innovation, what their approach is to this question. And really it comes down to the last line here, which is when we've achieved equity, no matter what your race or other social identity, it won't be able to be used to predict your life outcomes. And when you bring it down to the context of waste no more, they might seem a little far apart, right? We're talking about recycling and composting. What does this mean? But we're going to get into, how do we apply this type of lens to this particular subject? So OSEI, they gave us a whole set of like 4 pages of questions that really they want city agencies or really any of us in this type of process to ask ourselves throughout the process, right? It's not just at the beginning. So at the beginning, sure, what are the desired outcomes of our work? We've all talked about that, to no end here. But who has been included? Who has not been included? Who's not at this table? Who we need to make sure that we're talking to. What resources do we need? What data do we need to identify issues that we're trying to solve? Does the impacted community, require relationship building? Do we need to compensate people for their engagement? Who's most impacted? And how are we going to be measuring the outcome of our efforts? So you don't need to read all these. All of this is going to be is already, or it's already in the Google Drive. So we'll get into some of the detail. So our work group, we really looked at these questions. So whom do we want to affirmatively help and support and not harm or penalize? What is our process to ensure that this lens is applied not just today in this discussion, but for the next number of months until we're done with this process? And then how do we help people? How do we provide support to certain communities or buildings? What are our policy options? And again, supports and incentives. So the first thing that we talk about is whom. And I'm gonna put Marguerite and possibly Ryan on the spot. And Renee, I'm sorry, Renee, you were there too. Of course you were. I apologize. You should always call me out when I neglect people. Marguerite, would you like to talk us through how we arrived at, or who we arrived at, or the whom?
Sure, and this is a tough question just because all of these different work groups and all of the audiences for composting, businesses, individuals, residents, it's very broad. It's not just individuals and communities, it's also businesses and things. But there's a lot of data out there, a lot of mapping tools that are in that last bullet, Justice 40, CDPG and VirusScreen, CASER, City and County of Denver has one, that really gets down to that census tract level. But that defines who is socially vulnerable, but applying that to waste no more, these are some of the other bullets that we came up with that is up for discussion, but historically underrepresented or marginalized folks, people of color, indigenous people, low income households, small businesses, minority owned businesses, women owned businesses, and certain special events. Anything else?
Go ahead. We talked about nonprofit organizations at the very first meeting. How come that wasn't included? Did you talk about that?
That was included.
We could say, it came up in the context of special events, but not nonprofits as like a business. So that's certainly, and again, we're gonna be going into the working groups, or I'm sorry, we're gonna be going into small groups just on equity as soon as we're done with this report out, so certainly, this list can grow.
Yeah, one of the questions for you all is gonna be who's like, what groups are missing here? Who's missing? So I assume there are gonna be plenty.
And we did only have one meeting.
And low-income households includes housing cost burden, I believe, which is also part of a lot of these metrics here.
And. Okay, and so this, now is this one of the places where I'm supposed to take down the PowerPoint?
Yeah, and then share the.
If we printed this.
You know
one,
what?
right? This is where it gets a little bit tricky. Okay, but we're gonna figure that out while I talk. Our office has another deliberative body called the Sustainability Advisory Council. Ryan's on it, Dan's on it, Stephen, who's not here, he's on it. This is a group of external stakeholders, just like yourselves. We have 6 different committees for the usual subjects in sustainability, like sustainable transportation, zero waste, energy, buildings and homes. So they meet monthly, and they do this kind of deliberation over our programs and policies, and they give us their ideas on what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing, how we should be changing things. And back in 2021, when they really started deliberating, they actually came up with a template that all the committees use, so that when they bring these recommendations forward, they all have the same questions answered. They're having the same type of conversation, and it really came up because of that way. So what'll happen is, one of these committees comes up with an idea, they present it to the full Sustainability Advisory Council, and the council members from other committees would say, well, wait, but did you think about this, and did you think about that, and how did you identify, the equity impact, and how do you identify greenhouse gas impact? And because those questions kept coming up, they came up with this idea for rubric. And I'm sorry, so did everybody in the room get this?
We are gonna pass it around, and it's also, I think, Sophia is going to maybe stop screen sharing this and then actually screen share the rubric. So Sophia.
Anna's the one who's screen sharing.
No,
Oh, there's Anna. Is that what we did in our equity group? I introduced this idea, Ryan talked about how we use it. And so what I did after the meeting was, I took OSCI's questions, I took your guiding principles, which we had earlier in the slideshow, and I took the SAC's recommendation template. And I put all those things together and came up with this draft template for your consideration. And in this moment, they were supposed to be, aren't they double-sided?
Yeah, but there's 3 pages.
Really?
Yeah, there was a,
All right, yeah. I haven't printed anything in a long time. So, I put them all together and came up with this. And if you wouldn't mind, for the moment, we're gonna go to the second page, which has the equity analysis. And this is what our small groups are gonna be using, for their discussion. The idea here is that, as we keep saying, you're going to make recommendations that you're gonna have to share with each other and discuss. Some of these are gonna come out of the work group. And so if all the work groups are using this same template, then you know that you're answering all the same questions, so that when you come back together as a full task force, then what I think it does is it removes a lot of the questions. You say, okay, I get it. Here's what the costs are gonna be for the city. Here's what the costs might be for the regulated entities. Renee, are you there? Okay. And so if we could go to, if you wanna go to the equity one, so, Councilman Clark, I'm gonna come go to your shoulder. So we're trying to keep it simple. I don't want this to be a tremendous amount of homework, but we do want it to be thorough enough that we haven't forgotten any really important pieces of information. So if you've got it in front of you, or folks online are able to look at it, and then I don't know if it's in there. Did Sophia also put it in the chat? Yeah, put it in the chat too, because it is already in the task force folder in the Google Drive. So then they can pull it up. So you can see that you would be asking yourselves questions like, okay, does this recommendation address barriers to success or provide support and incentives for the particular group that you're talking about? So when we look back at the whom, Renee in our group brought up the idea of certain special events should have considerations like smaller special events or nonprofit special events, or events that have, a particular mission. So, and that's all for us to deliberate. Have the representatives of these beneficiaries of the recommendation, have they been involved? So obviously here at the task force, there's some involvement, But in talking with OSCI, they also recommended that we actually create some focus groups for specific and specific representation, like residents of affordable housing. So let's say, for example, that we come up with a recommendation, whether it's about education and outreach to, that particular community. If we had a focus group with those folks, we could actually bounce that off of them and get some ideas from them. That's a type of really deep representation or input that would be helpful outside of just this task force. What's the impact on the beneficiaries? So there's cost impacts, there's feasibility impacts, and we can address all of that in here. Does the recommendation encourage the city to conduct a public engagement process? As we keep saying, there are going to be recommendations that you make that we wouldn't be able to implement until later, right? Till after you're done. So, for example, we all know that eventually money will be coming from the state through the extended producer responsibility law. So you might make a recommendation on how the city should allocate that money when it comes through. And your recommendation might say, and city, you need to have a public engagement process to do X, Y, Z, to talk to these particular groups to make sure that there's input. That's just an example. Same thing, if your recommendation is location-based, you might want to bring up, the city, yes, you should definitely, we've used the Enviro Screen tool from the state to identify, beneficiaries of this recommendation. And then finally, does this recommendation provide an opportunity for workforce training that will lead to quality jobs? And so you end up scoring this. It's really very simple. And so high, medium, low, the higher ones get a higher score, low gets a lower score. But really important feature, just because something scores low doesn't mean it doesn't move forward. There are going to be some recommendations that are beneficial to everyone, and it doesn't have a special carve out for a particular community. That's okay. It's not that it's not allowed, but what this does is it makes sure that we've asked all these questions, no matter what the recommendation is. Let's stop there.
So there's probably, my guess is people have a lot of questions, people may have a lot of comments. What we would like to do is get you into small breakout groups to discuss those questions and comments, and we really have 2 questions here. Okay. And great, I'll hand this to you to look at while I tell people what the questions are. So question 1, who's missing from the list of, and actually, I think this tool.
So you'll be able, on our screen, we'll be able to pull that up.
Great.
And so they can look at it.
If you look at the handout that Grace just gave you and folks online, you should have this screen sharing right now. Under the equity assessment, question 1, does this recommendation, you all see where I am? Does this recommendation address barriers to success, provide support incentives that have been identified as needed for particular groups at risk of greater burden? Specifically, people of color, indigenous people, communities where most residents have low incomes, or under-resourced businesses and special events. That is the current definition, draft definition of the who. So who's missing? Who does it not cover? So that's first. And are there particular tools, objective criteria you think would be useful to you to identify those neighborhoods and groups? Rose.
For another meeting, we discussed persons with disabilities and they didn't make it onto the list.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. And that's exactly, we assume that there are critical omissions in this list. Please capture that. This list was not intended, it was a starting place, and I think there probably will be others. So, excellent. Thanks, Rose. Secondly, this rubric that Grace has just provided you, as a starting point, is it complete? Is it usable? Does it ensure that equity is integrated into your decision-making process in a meaningful way? So those are the 2 questions. We're gonna ask you to go into small groups. The people online, task force members, please go into a breakout group with Sophia. Those of you who are members of the public and attending and observing, thank you for being here. We're gonna come back in about 20 minutes. And so we will hear back from all the small groups. We'll hear a report out, so you will hear what they talked about. But we're gonna ask you to just hang out and come back in 20 minutes. So please make it a breakout. So online.
I know.
So just online. Yeah. And so do you, was this the group that you were gonna have a person? So how about if I thought of it?
Yeah.
So great. Great. I'm gonna start with group number 4 and tell you who you are, and you're gonna be right in this corner. And just bring chairs over and everyone can circle around. Okay, does that make sense? Sonia, Jesse, Maggie, Chris Berry, and Van. You all are in group four over here with Grace in the second.
Move, yeah, let her get her other.
Yeah. Group one over in this corner with Jessica, who's back there raising her hand, who will come up here. Chris Gary, Anna Perks, Marguerite, Lori, and Chris Hines. That's behind. You all are right here. And then group two with Nina, who is over there in her spot. Holly. Brennan, who is sitting in for Stephen. Brian. And Councilman Clark. You all are over there with Nina, and then group three, Chris Woodburn, Josh Jackson, Clinton, Renee, and Ian / Brian, because I think you're taking over for Ian when you leave. Anyway, we go figure it out.
We're good right now.
You're good. Okay, so you all are in group three over there with Rose, raise your hand. So does that make Clinton, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, can you all hear me? Yeah. My proposal is that you all stay where you are. We go do a quick go around, hear from me for the 4 groups in this room, and then we hear from Sophia and the online group. And I think we're gonna do this relatively quickly because I have been circulating and you all have had remarkably consistent similar ideas, which is awesome. So what I'm gonna ask is maybe one group to go first. Maybe it's your group back there, group B, and or, and then what we're gonna do is just ask each of your groups just to add on anything that's missing. So no need, you could just do a +1, ditto, here's what's new, or here's what's different from our group. And then we'll go to the online groups. So does that sound good?
Yeah.
Josh, do you want to go first? Yeah, we need to go first.
We can go
So
first.
here's what we're gonna do is, first of all, hear from you all on who else is missing from this, who needs to be prioritized, who needs to be supported. Then we'll do another go around for the process. So who did you all talk about capture in terms of who needs to be?
Yeah. Yeah, so, we talked about people with disabilities, whether that be learning or physical. non-voters, like children, people who haven't had a say so in some of the decision making. The one that really had the most value to me personally was undocumented. I'm supposed to be the equity guy, I'm supposed to be the voice of the minorities here, and I'm honestly sitting here thinking about Black people, I'm thinking about women, I'm thinking about all these things. Never did it cross my mind that there are people facing a unique set of challenges that I don't understand.
Yeah.
Elderly, which is another big one. Volunteer operators. Qualifying. The reason there's an abstract on nonprofit, there are extremely wealthy nonprofits that will take advantage of every loophole. So we would have to define and come up with some criteria for that. Non-English speakers, which is, again, like another disproportionate thing that affects people I wouldn't think or understand. Group homes we have up here, under-resourced buildings, or maybe buildings that are already distressed financially in some kind of way and getting burdened with greater inequity. And we have affordable condensed housing.
Affordable condensed.
Like
Yeah. Go ahead.
affordable housing units, and we talked about this phrase when we met with OCI, but that cost not be passed on to those residents who are already facing hardship to begin with.
Yeah, I remember now. So the affordable condensed housing was relating to developers and landlords passing on costs and making affordable housing no longer affordable.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. My guess is there will be lots of consistencies, and let's go to Nina, your group, how about next? What's new, what's different?
Okay, so what is different? So we did have some crossover, but some expansion, specifically on the nonprofit, we kind of like built out different scenarios of nonprofit. So one is like nonprofit in a building, you know, like a tenant. And then another nonprofit as a liquor license beneficiary, and then who would the responsibility fall on, the organizer or the liquor license fee. Food banks and pantries, so similarly, if they're collecting food waste, is it their responsibility to find disposal or whatever, or where they're recovering it from? And then, we talked about renters, and then, not necessarily who is on that list, but is there city or state OSCI staff who could serve as some advisor for within the room?
Oh, so that's kind of a process question, or a process objection. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Love it.
Did I got everything?
You good? Okay, good. Jessica,
Really quickly, so expanding on the nonprofits, we did say community-based nonprofits on that one, and then also not really the biggest equity point, but people who don't live here, and tourists. So, you know, work here, play here.
okay. Otherwise, and you all had a overlap, I assume.
Yeah, overlap,
Talked about
language barriers.
language barriers.
We so often do English Spanish, but it's.
Non-
so much harder than that even in there.
Yeah, thank you. I think that could capture that too, but it's an important one. Okay,
Yeah.
your group.
Lots of overlap here too. And so I guess I'll add, food trucks and food carts. They're very small businesses, and we also were wondering if the responsibilities that they're given in the ordinance, we don't know that they have that responsibility now. That like, do they actually provide their own waste service? And how do they handle it? So there's that. We talk about exemptions, like what happens when a business can't get a contract, like, is that an equity consideration? How about site constraints? And I think that's, maybe I'm overdoing it. But also then DDE, in addition to MWBE, because MWBE is a city designation, DDE is state federal.
What's DBE?
Disadvantaged business enterprise.
Okay, and then, thank you. Folks online and Sophia's group, are you all able to go off mute and let us know what else you talked about? Anything different?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect. So we talked as of renters and as a whole, tenants as a whole as a category, and then as well as small haulers, had a few conversations around just as things are being streamlined. There is a potential for smaller haulers to be left behind or priced out as kind of the bigger organizations come in who provide multiple services at once. And so those were the two outstanding categories we discussed.
Nice. You all came up with really amazing ideas in this. Thank you so much. Really helpful. So can we do another round and we hear from you about the process? What do you think is this process, is the criteria list, the sort of checklist, meaningful, usable, comprehensive? Can we start with your group, Josh, again?
Yes.
Okay.
The first thing we talked about was feedback and looping in on the ongoing revisions.
So adding an extra step 7.
Oh, adding
Feedback.
step.
Yeah. And that's very important. I mean, that was one of the issues with the Green Roof Initiative. Is there were people missing from the table originally, which left a few gaps in that.
So
I'm not missing.
no one being. The last thing the thing you just said, so you're talking about adding a step 7 that has to do with going and getting feedback and checking in who's missing, is that
Yeah, an ongoing conversation.
the ongoing?
We're not gonna get it perfect.
Yeah.
Fine.
Perfect, thank you, got it.
And then the next one we have is making this easily understood, and what is the outreach / education component, like all of these recommendations being not, if the people don't know that there are new rules and that these rules and guidelines need to be followed. So how do we make sure there's an outreach and education piece as well?
Excellent. Okay, thank you, group 4. Group 3, okay, I don't know if that's what they call it.
Yeah, but, okay, so a few additions. One, we wanted to just kind of focus on this idea of what is health versus harm mean, and what are we implying when we say that something is harmed by it, is just having recycling composting a harm, and or is that being implied? And then does a similar list already exist, or a similar checklist already exist at your state level? This is one model, but are we reinventing, when perhaps there's something already there? And then, so looking at specific questions, so a number 3, is the impact from this positive or negative, and does that mean, and is high or low mean it's good or bad, so some kind of, like, explanation area?
So like clarifying what the question means when it says impactful.
Yes, like is impact positive or negative, and does that?
Say it again.
Does impact mean positive or negative, and does that affect that work?
Yes, thank you.
So, and then some of the recommendations that we'll have won't have any workplace implications, so that's a whole question, so will those get a ding? Because they don't have any work, those inherently don't have any workplace implications, that's a number 6. And then things that's missing and other comments or what else section, maybe like a not applicable option. Like, for example, there's no workplace implications, if they're rated X out. And then is there a question that says to ensure that every beneficiary has been consulted and is actually over?
Okay. Which is slightly different than what this group was talking about in terms of education outreach here.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's connected. Consultation.
Yeah.
Education outreach has some overlap, but also the same. Is that true?
Yeah.
When you were talking about consultation?
Yeah.
Okay. And the first thing, when you were talking about who is helped versus who's harmed, needing a little more definition around that, you mean like, if it's a question on the checklist, it needs to be defined, what the terms are, is that what you meant?
Yeah, I think just like, what do we mean by help versus harm?
Yeah.
In the whole equity conversation.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, yeah.
Sorry, I raised the question that's on the screen
Yeah.
implies that we intend to harm someone. Right? Who do we want to help and not harm?
Yeah.
And I just thought it was a tough lens.
Yeah.
To look at that. I get what we're trying to get at, but maybe we need to reframe the question.
The language, yeah.
And also does that imply that someone has to recycling and composting services in our harm,
Right,
right?
and I think the question was very much talking about cost.
Yeah.
But I think your point is well taken, that let's be more clear.
Cost and vulnerability to penalties,
Yeah.
right, is the harm.
Right, but it's a good point. Let's be clear about what we're asking, especially as we ask the public and as we ask other people, thanks. Yeah,
So we shared some similar thoughts, that group, and then also something for us to think about on this rubric.
can you all hear Jessica over there?
Can you hear
Hey,
me?
Chris, can you hear Jessica? Can you guys hear Jessica?
Can you hear me now? How about now? Alright, mic check. Alright, so some things to think about are, do we evaluate like the long-term and short-term impacts on this rubric at all? And then do we evaluate the impact to the other who's in this rubric? And then also, how are we incorporating these things like back into our recommendation, not just like we're asking the questions and then it's done, but then how do we like go back and revise and make it better? Anything else?
I failed to keep my group on track, we did the whole time on the.
Do you have, does anyone have anything to add that hasn't been said that comes to mind before we go to the online group?
Yeah, can I just, the who, we don't wanna highlight one underserved community at the expense of another underserved community. I just wanna make sure that that was, underscored, so one of the questions I think in the rubric should be, does promoting this one option have a detrimental effect on another community?
We also needed more time too, so I was like, we've all thought about recommendations that we, have in mind for the language, let's play with this, and then come back and give us some feedback later.
Well, and
There will be plenty of time.
yeah, and we'll go to the online group, but my assumption is that the equity work group and Grace, who helped leading that group, will do some chewing on this in light of your feedback.
Yes,
Yes, okay, great. Sophia, and the online group.
So I'll speak to that. Just want to make sure you can still hear me okay?
yep.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we spent quite a bit of time on the first question and definitely less on the second one, but as it turns out, we all kind of felt like we just didn't have so much actual experience with putting these into action and seeing what was missing. And so we didn't have great things that we could add to it, but we thought once it's in practice, we would have really good feedback on it. So after hearing everything that everyone talked about, it feels like so much was captured there. So that's where we landed.
Perfect, thank you. I think, yes, I think that is probably true. There'll be lots more refining once people get into it. Okay, so I do think that just to wrap this up and let everyone take a 5-minute break and then let you all reconvene around the circle, that I think that's what's gonna happen is we're gonna write all this up. We're gonna share with the equity work group for now, have them see about how it can be incorporated. And then come back to you all. And Grace, I don't know if you want to say anything more, but Nina, I think that your group has something to say about whether this kind of tool is being used elsewhere. And I think you want to reiterate what I mean.
Yeah, so, well, the format itself is being used currently by our Sustainability Advisory Council. The questions that they have are slightly different because their context is different. I don't know of any other evaluation tool like this being used. Brian, you can have something?
Group, and I don't remember who the.
It was me at the state, and we have a Department of Local Affairs, and it's very similar, and it really is just meant to be a tool for discussion and incorporation. I think like overthinking the technicalities is, but yeah, I can share that with Grace, and I said that I would, so.
Okay.
But I will, yeah.
Perfect. But you're gonna see later in this conversation, you're going to see that there's another half of this rubric. Actually, you have it in your hand. So we're gonna go through that as well. So it's a whole package.
Yeah. But, yeah, and to Marguerite's point, I think part of us having this conversation is not just so that we have, but it's also to have the conversation so that it's top of mind, so that it's built into everything we do and the way we think about this work. So I think that's the other idea, okay. So with that, we want to give everyone 5 minutes. Are people okay with just taking 5 minutes? And coming back so because we have a lot more to get through, and come back at like 47 after the hour, and you can sit in your regular seat. We're gonna go to small groups again in a minute. Yes, Glenn.
We have like 7 minutes and we can walk to our car.
Yeah. And people say, we'll be back. Everybody should get people trickling in, but are we not then? Awesome. All right, we're Chris and Gary. So, all right,
Yes.
we're starting now. We're calling you out by name.
Well, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Holy.
Okay, so just to remind us where we are on the agenda, which is great. All right, so a number of your. This is something really fun. That basic, by the way, we're about to get hammered by a department according to Anna, it's in 14 minutes.
Oh my God, it's really, yeah.
But she- We'll ask. So we're at the part of the agenda, where we're gonna start talking about supports and incentives. Ian? Right. We're gonna start talking about supports and incentives, but because Van had a really useful suggestion recently about clarifying what goes in the ordinance and actually in the language itself, in the rules and regs versus where do supports and incentives fit that actually are outside the ordinance, but are critical to its success and have to be discussed by the task force and that you all can recommend. So that prompted Grace to do some framing. So we're gonna turn to her and then we're gonna come back to Jordan.
Right, and again, I'll tell you the origin of this in the conversation with Van, just to boil it down is. He has an idea for a zoning change that he thinks is necessary and be a good idea. He thought that could be done for this, and so I explained that that is not the case. So zoning changes to other city policies, changes to other city codes, those are their own process. If you think that that is something that should be done, we have a whole category for that, right? There's a whole section of changes that the city might need, or things the city might need to do to help make wastewater more implementable, more successful, but that is outside of this ordinance itself. So I am going to just make sure that we're all really clear on what's in the ordinance and rules and regs and what is outside of that. You are still allowed to make recommendations to things that are outside of that. We just want to make sure everybody's clear. So what goes in the ordinance? It's really relatively simple, right? Who is being regulated? So we've talked a lot about that. That is already enumerated in the ordinance itself. What are the regulations? So in this case, it's providing access to compost and recycling. It is not performance. That is something that's come up a lot. So the idea that you will recycle well, that all of your composting will be uncontaminated, that is not regulated by this ordinance. It is simply access to those services. And then of course, it's C&D. What exemptions are allowed? Exemptions go in the ordinance, could also go in rules and regs. What are the penalties for non-compliance? That's also, that's the law. That's what we're able to enforce on. How can the penalties be appealed? That's always important, right? Even if you get a ticket in the city for anything, you can appeal that. If we're gonna fine you for something, there has to be a way for you to appeal. And then when is compliance required? And so obviously that's the phasing, the rollout, the timeline. So just wanted to go through really quickly dissecting the ordinance, again, and a lot of this is coming from the perspective of we city staff will eventually have to enforce it. Are all of those elements here? I'm not gonna, in the interest of time, I'm not gonna read everything, but you can see here a couple of points of interest. So in buildings, it's defined who is regulated, and we should repeat this because I think it's come up with confusion over the eight unit issue. Buildings, single family homes and apartment buildings up to 7 units, those are serviced by the city and county of Denver. Everything else, 8 units and up, that's regulated by this ordinance. So we have what the regulation is, the exemptions reference a rules process, but the penalties and appeals, those aren't specified. So we know these are things we're gonna have to write, we will have to write those in. Food waste producers, this is an interesting one. So the list is defined, and what we did here, Erica wasn't able to be here today, but she did help us with this. We talked about this earlier. There are some food waste producers that are already licensed by the city. We want to make sure, we talk about simplicity, we do want to make sure to take advantage of any license opportunity we have, because we are already talking with those folks, they're already doing something with us on an annual basis. We want to make sure that we're just rolling this requirement into at least the reporting requirement into what they're already doing. And so again, getting down to penalties and appeals, those aren't necessarily, those aren't specified in the ordinance. Special events. And Rose is here, which is great, so she can speak to that question. But the ordinance is very specific to permitted events. So permitted events that go through the Office of Special Events are events that are open to the public and they're held on public property. What's different are events that are held on Department of Parks and Rec properties. Still here? Ran out just in time. So neighborhood block parties, a family reunion in the park, those big, like youth soccer tournaments held at the park, those don't come through Office of Special Events for permits. So this is a question, we want to talk to the ballot sponsors about their intent. Is the intent to include those types of events as well? You don't have to answer that today. But these are the things we might want to talk about as we get, deep into the weeds on the ordinance itself. C&D. C&D is interesting. It's a short section, but it packs a lot in there. It does reference that the city should establish a rules process to define penalties for non-compliance. It also doesn't have an appeals process. It does speak a little bit to exemptions, which is also interesting. And of course, readily recyclable is not defined. And that's a really, in general, there's a lot of terms that need to be defined, which is a normal thing for ordinances to do. And this ordinance as written does not have that. So then this is everybody's favorite category, I think, or second favorite category maybe, is everything else, right? So what is outside the ordinance? So financial support, technical assistance, incentives, and then policy, like I mentioned earlier. Other things that the city already has rules for that you think should be different, that would help with waste and more, is something to talk about. And I would also add, I think that, I didn't write it here, but I think that what also belongs in policy is there's been a lot of discussion about the city of Denver's role in the regional waste ecosystem. There's a lot that needs to be done there. And so you can make recommendations about what position should the city take in that? What role should it take? What do you want to see in the regional ecosystem? All of that, I think, is still under the category of policy. Again, not in the ordinance, but I think it's important to us for you to make recommendations that are outside the ordinance, because it could work its way into our work plan at some point, right? And then like this, we need to maximize this opportunity that we have here with this public engagement process with you. And then as we go out for public comment later, this is a tremendous opportunity for us. We don't do these all the time. And so we want to take advantage of it. I feel like
Great.
yes.
Sure. I'm also interested in, things that aren't in the ordinance. I think that the sponsors picked the scope that they picked because everything else is covered by the city. And I'd be curious, even though it's not part of the ordinance, I'd like to see how the two interact to make sure that we have a comprehensive solution for trash recycling and composting for every unit and including youth soccer tournaments. I want to know that we have something for the entire city. That isn't in the ordinance. The ordinance is just everything else that the city doesn't cover, but. You see what I'm saying?
I might see what you're saying. I think when it comes to communication and engagement, which is really going to be the bulk of the July meeting, the one uniform that, just one quick second. the one thing I think that we all agreed upon in the first meeting, and it has come up repeatedly, is we want every person in Denver to get the same message, no matter where they are.
Yes,
So, yes, so in terms of communication, engagement, signage, symbols, yes, we agree that'll be a recommendation coming out. I just wanted to differentiate that from the hauling and the service providing, which will stay separate.
I guess, yeah, so we want the same message to everyone because we want it to apply to everyone regardless if you're at
Yes.
1 unit, 50 units, did the 420 event in Civic Center Park or a youth soccer tournament or whatever. Like, I want, in my opinion, it should apply to the entire city, and thanks to the sponsors, we're getting everything else that we couldn't get through ordinance because of state law, from units, or from single family home to 7 units.
Was that a question?
No, I'm
Okay.
just saying,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that, we do some analysis somewhere that, that we are indeed touching everything in
Not
the city.
responsive to the
Oh,
We're not missing anything, because I think the whole point of Waste No More is,
Ah.
this is one thing, this is.
Maybe
covering
that,
everything
maybe
else.
Ian had his hand up, so maybe Ian has to come on.
Well, I was just gonna say where I think the two interfaces in the solid waste master plan. And does that need to be updated now that there's a passage of this? Is that maybe the recommendation? I don't know the normal cycle on when the plan is due up next, but this obviously interacts in there. And to me, that's the public policy you're talking about, which is what it looks now and where we're trying to go with our goals.
I think it's a great point that we need to just note and make sure, like, yeah. The decision-making process is a way to capture, like, look at the holistic picture to make sure nothing is falling through the cracks. If there is, it should have a.
I'm writing down, are there any places
Are there-
falling through the cracks?
Yeah, so like if we missed youth soccer tournaments.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a policy or ordinance that we should consider, just so that we don't have to say, well, if you're doing a youth soccer tournament, you can just throw your stuff on the ground, we don't care.
Yeah. No, it's a good example. It'll. Yeah, Rose, and then Marguerite, yeah.
So now licensing is when we're.
I can't hear you.
We discussed responsibilities in great detail. We didn't today, because we're focused on equity and incentives and things like that. So those conversations are happening. We're just not talking about them right now, but like who is missing? Is there anyone included that shouldn't be? Things like that, the responsibilities piece is definitely part of what we're discussing.
Okay, so thank you for the heads up, because I think that's for buildings and the licensee work groups, that there's a very comprehensive discussion around who's being covered and who's not covered. So that's another way to look at it. Okay, good. So, okay, yeah, so now that whole framing was intended to contextualize this next sort of exercise for you all, which is what supports and incentives are needed to make Waste No More workable, to make it especially workable for people who we have just talked about in terms of communities that need extra support. And this is the initial, this is like to help seed your brainstorming. These are ideas that have already been discussed so far. You did print them, but unfortunately there are 2 different pages in there. Anyway, we're gonna have to reteach Grace about one page. It's been a long time since
I needed help in the printing.
So, but the good thing is we have handouts for you to use in your small groups. I don't know if any of the work group leads, Rose or Nina, want to speak to any of these things, but I'm happy to just read through what's on here and then give you all, actually, Grace, do you mind reading through these and I'll hand these out so we can look it up?
Okay, so again, the idea is that this is what we've done so far, and it's a combination of the last 2 meetings that we've had, plus the work groups, and frankly, if we've had any other conversations with you, with multiple people, it's generally appearing here. So I guess while it's being handed out, I am gonna read this. So, financial support, now the top list, the top column or top row here, these are supports for anybody. That below here would be support for targeted groups. So city funded access to bins for one-off uses, so this sounds like something that applies to probably the special event. We talked about sharing resources, like how can the city help facilitate the sharing of bins in an alley so that you don't have like 4 dumpsters for 4 different businesses. Providing how-to guidance on setting up effective sorting systems. That could be passive, like a guidebook, but there could actually also be technical assistance. Workforce training, our office funds some workforce training, maybe there could be something related to that, and it's janitorial, drivers, haulers, and sorters. Best practices, guidance specific to community events, and again, this to speak to who's falling through the cracks. Are there community events that aren't required to comply, but we required to comply, and we want them to know about it? Deconstruction contractors program, so I think that's related to workforce training. Financial incentives. Financial incentives for any regulated entity. Do we want to do that? And then of course below that, we would have financial incentives and grants specifically for under-resourced businesses or building. Recognition and incentive for early compliance or going beyond minimum standards. And then in policy, we've got zoning code, CPD purchasing requirements. So we do not have any requirements on our own specifications, say for using compost as a soil additive or recycled content or recycled aggregate in our roadway projects. Is that something we want to take a look at? And then regional collaboration, again, what is Denver's role? Down here in the equity target, there was mention of for small businesses and maybe even small events, can the city help sponsor a group buying program? Like everybody's on their own right now, everybody's got to get their own contracts. Could businesses save money if we went out and did that for them, or some other entity would? I mean, I don't know the legal requirements. We don't have any of our lawyers in the room, but if it's something that's mentioned and worth considering. Again, subsidies and grants, whether it's for under-resourced household, if the cost is being passed on to them directly, and then for buildings that serve under-resourced households, as well as resources for under-resourced events. Peer educators there, food scrap collectors and pilots and low-income multi-family units. We already mentioned the financial incentives, and then exemptions. That is a policy, and frankly, that probably is something that would be in the ordinance itself. But exemptions and or if there are fee waivers we had there, I don't think we have mentioned the fees yet, but if they come up, should that be exempted?
Yep. Okay, so with that,
Can
Chris,
there be an assumption of fee since Denver's moved towards a charge for trash service, especially residential?
well, and so
I guess so I went through that conversation, as did a number of other people here. What that did was it actually put Denver residents on the even playing field with everybody else. Because this whole sector already is paying for waste and that sector wasn't.
but here's what we're gonna do is we're gonna ask you all to get into your same small groups that you were in earlier. We're running late, so we'll take 20 minutes, after the hour. So please get in your groups quickly, and we're gonna have your facilitators walk you through basically what's missing from each of these categories and what specifically on equity. So that's the question. We'll see you back at 4:25. So we're terms have not come.
Long past it.
So. Here. Lincoln, Can you over here? No. So folks online, hopefully you're hearing this, we're gonna hear from this group first, and Van has generously volunteered, and I'm gonna ask you to do the same thing where you just build on whatever else you've heard, don't feel like you need to repeat things, even though you may have the same ideas. Go ahead.
All right, we're gonna go quick. So there's a lot of policies that we brought up, a bid, that points to CCD. So encouraging the Parks Department to, buy more compost. Another policy for haulers to report contamination so that repeat offenders, are reported back to the city and they can be addressed if the hauler drops a certain client. Haulers, another policy suggestion was for haulers to provide education, and another incentive was to.
Wait.
Wait a minute.
So those are policies.
Yeah, policy
And now,
incentives.
and now talk to us about incentives.
Okay, so incentives, for educating staff on best practices. And then, so for,
Educating staff on best practices and how's that an incentive?
So it should be, they should be businesses should be incentivized for educating their staff. So I mean, from a restaurant perspective, for example, if people are just handed a piece of paper and are like, here's how you have to do it versus really going through like an educational training seminar or something, could they somehow be incentivized for trying to do the right thing?
Awesome.
so for financial supports, we have, financial support for on-site processing, encouraging large apartment complexes or food banks to purchase, anaerobic digesters, et cetera. City funded signage, so there should be city funded signage that we're gonna talk about in the next meeting. And then we have for, technical support, we have, guidance onto, our communication feedback, but kind of touches on the comment earlier about contamination reporting. And then another technical support is a list of accredited zero waste trainers and planners. So if a hauler isn't doing the training and onboarding, maybe they can work with an accredited service provider who's doing that training and onboarding for them. And then tool for calculating waste for C&D permitted projects. And then directory of businesses that provide technical support for that. So
The bid point was more of a time incentive.
The what point?
Bid points.
Bid point.
Maybe, and let's say that one out loud. So this is the idea that if a business, and I think this is really in the C&D space, but if a business has a really good record for C&D recycling, then the city should reward them extra points when they're going through a bidding process.
Got it. Thank you. And did you all have any equity specific? Okay, just want to make sure you know. Okay. Okay, so I would say most of what we talked about, we couldn't quite tell which bucket it fell into, so for which were we placed. But for financial support, we have, could the city, lend out parks to events so we could tie together residential and commercial, where people recognize the both. Positive reinforcement. So if people are doing it wrong, how do we positively correct them? Think about like dog training. So then we have kind of like, we're talking about the group buying situation, kind of talking about the pros and cons, so like cautioning against it, for the sense that it pushes out small dollars, which we put down as an equity concern as well. But then on the plus side, what's the environmental impact of local haulers, if there could be a more streamlined hauling system, that reduces that environmental impact. Other policies, this one really we can cover quick, but land use, land access, for more infrastructure. Somewhere, in one of these buckets. For technical support, we have, making sure, some way to set up the right types of collection infrastructure, so like, for example, the city needs lots dumpster, how do we build that recommendation in?
And then kind of incentivizing a little bit different truck infrastructure for small haulers, there are benefits. And some work with more densely populated parts of the city for smaller haulers. And then incentives, we have incentives for various infrastructure to set up shop in Denver, knowing that there's an increased market here. So like whether that's haulers, processors, transportation, all those places, there's some kind of incentivization for those businesses that come to Denver now that there are more. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Great job. Rose, thank you.
So for, I put up there like the city funding just for our costs, for internal costs, trying to figure out where that funding is gonna come from. And then Josh asked about cost analysis, and I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that a little bit and stuff.
Yeah, I'm wondering what the entire, I think it'd probably be impossible to come up with a number, but what is an approximate number that this will cost the city? What is an approximate number that this will cost like a citizens and business? Sure, there's some kind of like audit or something that we can do that will give us some kind of estimate. Again, I think that this is all stuff that we really need to be sustainable. There is cost implication that definitely needs to be looked at this whole entire thing, as well as the cost that we're passing on.
So I can speak to that a little bit. So from the city's perspective, we can analyze how much we think it costs us, right, in terms of administration or inspection. We have no insight into the cost to the private sector because we don't collect that data. And so we're actually, some people know I've sort of reached out to a couple of people starting to ask for some of that information. And we're gonna try to create that over the next couple of months.
So maybe we'll just make that note to your group's point that especially for the private sector, there isn't information at this point in terms of the cost. Okay, thank you. Can we?
I just want
yeah.
to, one quick, so as someone who has been in corporate America before becoming a slimy politician, there are disciplines that do that make those financial estimates, you know, so there are professions that make that happen.
I'm aware of that, and that's kind of somewhere my thought is like, that needs to be implemented in this conversation. When we're talking about equity, if we're not looking at it, we can't have a real equity conversation and at the same time say, we can't do an analysis on the cost of what this is gonna affect people outside of the city. That's not equity on the top.
That's great, and I need to think of that as like technical assistance somehow for. Keep going, sorry.
Okay, so for technical supports, we had a lot. So certified resources, but I think what we mean by that is like a vetted list that we can provide to people so that we know. Yes, this service can be provided that people can go to for different sectors and identify, you know, just for ease of identifying a contractor.
Yep. We heard that in this group as well. It sounds similar. Yes.
Okay. Let's see. A consideration for the expansion of certifiably green. So certifiably green is already a program that's happening in the city. And if somebody is looking for additional resources, say not just for waste diversion, but other greening, that they would be able to do that. So hopefully it's going to funnel more people with that and keeping it in our lens. Pilot programs to create best practices, volunteer education, standardization, or some sort of like, again, probably best practices for training volunteers, because for a lot of spaces, those are going to be the pre-sorters. Diversion calculator on benefits so that we can be messaging that out, like what we're actually diverting and reinforcing with people what the benefit of this is. And then under equity specific for technical support, we were talking about language translation accuracy, you know, because it's like if you just use Google Translate, that's not necessarily the best. And I was telling our group, we have a language access executive order in the city. So that will play into that, but that's just for city stuff. I don't know how that would work for private sector. Under other policies, and this is already being discussed, but the noise ordinance alignment, right now, the noise ordinance limits when haulers can pick up trash. And if there's gonna be more haulers and more pickups, then how are we gonna right size that so that policies don't conflict with one another? And then under incentives, or performance recognition, so if we're diverting a certain percentage and someone's going above and beyond that, like how can those businesses and entities be recognized?
Thank you. We're gonna take 30 more seconds for this group. Can you guys be quick enough to do the timeline? No problem.
We also had the same thought about certified legal and just like the general need for information for property owners to understand how to right size their containers, what the costs are associated with that, up and down for trash collection and compost. And then funding, financial supports, like for funding for reuse, building reuse, like boulder doubles. And looking at, and then paying, financial support also maybe for green janitorial programs. And then getting more to the technical side of it, not only depending on the city for city provided best practices, but just like a more collaborative effort across all partners. And looking at city owned land for the increased processing needs. And then grants, grant assistance, not just grants, but offering that technical assistance for applying those grants to marginalized communities. And then incentives, incentivizing on-site processing with another one. That can put it up. And then the D deposit.
Great. Thank you. Super, super, super. Okay. Sophia, Peggy, the online group, are you all able to share anything that is additional that you have?
I'll share from the online group, and in the interest of time, and can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and not to repeat what other folks have shared. So in the financial support category, we emphasize that for it shouldn't just be necessarily space challenge businesses that have the opportunity to share resources or otherwise offset their costs while addressing space constraint issues. In the technical support category, educational resources for employees, tenants, users of collection systems, just making sure that we have sort of a 360 suite of available documentation and other forms of technical support for all parties involved. As others have mentioned, we already have existing programs such as Certifiably Green Denver that exist and could perhaps be bolstered and maybe reinvented in some ways to ensure that the incentives that they're designed to provide actually do something positive for the businesses that do get involved or that go above and beyond and achieve a compliance early to this ordinance. So kind of a crossover there. Yeah, and as others have mentioned, the real bottleneck that some of us are already experiencing is on the processing side. So not just with the city and county of Denver, but having, cross municipal engagement to take a look at the zoning and code issues that make it a lengthy and expensive process to set up new processing capacity for our region if we're going to be able to actually handle all this material, certainly in the composting side of things and with other materials as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. Is that all for your group? Anything else? Okay.
Yeah, if anyone wants to add anything.
Okay, good. So in terms of, first of all, thank you all so much. And I feel like the combination, there was definitely some crossovers, but you all actually had a lot of different ideas on this one. So I think what we're going to do is just update that chart, update those ideas and supply them to the work group so that you all can make sure to capitalize on all the ideas that were generated here. So watch for these ideas to be built into recommendations that come to you in the upcoming month or months. And with that, I think, oh yes,
If we signed up to be on a work group, but we weren't available for their first meeting, like, can we still be on those work groups just in case we're available for the next one? Or?
100%. So before we leave today, we're gonna make an announcement about the work groups, and I wanted to Cindy's point, emphasize that if you all haven't signed up for a work group, but really want to get on a work group, or you want to just attend one of the work group meetings with no other commitments, that is all gonna be made available to you. So
We'll send the sign ups out again, it'll be a whole other set of doodles.
yeah, and then what we're gonna do is also send out the times to all of you about when the work groups are meeting, what the agenda topics generally are, and what the links. Okay?
Okay.
So now we're gonna wrap up, and but with, in this wrap up, we are. Grace to say, we wanted to take a little bit of time before we talk about your concrete next steps in the June meetings to basically walk through how we're envisioning taking the discussion that you all have been having at the task force, then the work groups refinement and discussion of more of the granular ideas, how we're gonna develop recommendations for you, and then how you're gonna decide and approve the recommendations and refine them. So, yay, yes.
Yeah,
Leah,
all right, so, and this is, I'm happy because I thought I was like 2 minutes instead of more. Right, we have now had 3 meetings full of talk, right? Plus all the work group meetings, so there's been a lot of conversation. It is time to start writing things down, right? It is time to start putting some ideas on paper that you can really hash it out and say, okay, here's a recommendation, does this work? And yes, it works for these, but no, it doesn't work in that. So we have to start some real deliberation. So if you'll refer back to the paper you already got, remember we looked at the evaluation rubric, we just looked at the equity part. If you want to take a look at the front part, again, I don't know how to turn it for you, and you can return to your seat if you want to, if you need to, quietly, of course. So, and then online people, Taylor, are people seeing it? Do you have it in the chat for them? Yes. Okay, so this is, again, going back to this, the idea came, this is the same format that the Sustainability Advisory Council uses. So the idea is that all of our recommendations will eventually find their way into this format. So we're all looking at the same thing. And did I turn off the example?
No.
Okay, well, shoot.
And so,
I don't know what to do about that. I'm not gonna worry about it. So here's what I did. I actually took one of the things we talked about that seems relatively simple enough that we haven't kept talking about it, right? It's the idea of the annual diversion plan. We want information from all the regulated entities. There's no question about that. The question is, do they need to, is the end result, is the outcome that we want best served by doing that every single year? Or can we instead have kind of what we do with our MWBE requirement, which is you have a no change affidavit that you do every year. So you click this thing, says, nope, I've still got the same hauler. I'm still, composting, so recycling, I've got my education program, I'm done. That's all they have to do every year. That is different than submitting an annual recycling plan. And so if you guys can, for those of you who are on the chat, at least you can drop that in. And for everybody else, we'll send out to the link that there's already an example of this in your Google Drive. But I actually took one of these and I wrote it all out just to see if this format works. For that, I didn't print that one out. So again, we weren't going to ask for a decision on this, but the idea is that it goes through every one of these. It first says, okay, what section is this ordinance? What section of the ordinance is it talking about, if applicable, right? Because everything we just talked about are not sections of the ordinance. So you can still make recommendations that are outside the ordinance using this form. You have a description of what is the recommendation. And then you go through, again, what are the costs and benefits? Who is it, who is it helping? You've gone through the equity assessment to make sure it's not harming anybody. And then we would actually bring that to these meetings and start talking about that. We'll also be able to circulate them for everyone to read in between meetings as homework, so that when we come back together, we'll all be fully informed. So with what Ryan was just saying, we're going to have the work groups continue meeting, but I think we'd like you to start honing in on actually drafting recommendations that then can be circulated to everyone. So when we come back together in June, we can have some real serious deliberations about some of these issues.
yeah, and I want to say a couple more things about that, but Brian, do you?
I have a question on the annual diversion plan. Is this solely about the hauler, or does this look at the entities' efforts to change their waste stream?
So this is based on what's written in the ordinance, which is for the regulated entity, and all regulated entities would need to submit to the city an annual recycling plan. That would be one of the things that we would enforce. So if an entity failed to submit this plan, that is something we would have to face them down for. Right, and so a couple of us spoke with, City of Austin, and they highly recommend moving away from a full annual plan or full plan being submitted annually. They have 10 people on staff. All they do is chase plans. They don't get to do any outreach related to like, are your systems working? Are we getting the outcomes we want? They're just like, have you submitted your plan? And so we want to stick with the intent, which is we have the basic information. They still have, entities still have to tell us that it's working. We can still enforce on it, but we would move our attention to the substance of what's actually happening. What are the outcomes? So that would be circulated to all of you to look at. The idea here again is not asking you to make a decision yet. Take a look at it, review it and say, okay, does this answer all the questions that we're looking for? Is this format going to work? And if we need to add more questions, if we need to take away questions from this format, we'll do that. Because again, we want to have, there's some level of uniformity helps make for more structured conversations.
So just to reiterate, because I see puzzle faces and then we'll see what questions you all have. Basically, you all received this piece of paper and you would screen share it except for the technical difficulties of doing that right now. But it's the stuff in blue and it says in little blue letters up top, WNN is recommendation evaluation rubric. And so basically what's going to happen between now and June for things like certain for the phasing, or maybe the diversion plan, or requirements about the different aspects of the ordinance. Okay, so Grace, you can go through this, but you're gonna get, I think this, you all are gonna discuss these things in your work groups. You're gonna get more granular. The city staff who's working with the work groups is gonna come, walk you through some different options. And you all are gonna give some guidance as work group members. And then staff is gonna, I think, help draft, I think staff can be responsible for this part. Is that right?
Yes and no. So I would say it like this. You're already volunteering your time. This is, and not only coming to these meetings, but you're going to work group meetings. We are gonna ask you to do homework, right? And actually read whatever recommendations people come out with. If you want staff to assist by writing things up, like being the scribes from the work groups, we will do that. But I don't want to disempower you from writing these yourselves. So if you collectively want, like if your work group wants to assign someone from the group to actually be the scribe and start drafting it, you can do that. But I just want you to know that we are here to help. We don't want to take over. We don't want this to be our work. But again, this is our job. And for you, you are here as volunteers. So I want to balance that burden.
And so from my perspective, the two like administrative things that need to happen are taking your ideas and putting them in the form of, here's what the report's gonna say, here's actually the recommendation language in the draft form for people to refine and edit and feel great about. And then doing this form for each of those individual recommendations, where this is for the diversion plan, like draft example. And so there would be like a paragraph or a page or whatever on here's what it would say in the ordinance. And then let's do this little one-page analysis so that you guys have a.
Yeah, and I should say, like, no one is expecting you to write ordinance language the way the city does. At this point, it's just what is your general recommendation on how we should move, like in what direction? It will go to the city staff and especially the city attorney's office. Once all your recommendations, your final report is done, we take that, we write it into ordinance language. We're still going to be sharing that with you again before it goes to city council. So we have a long way to go before we get there, but we need to start getting all these ideas you're deliberating. We got to start getting it down on paper and actually start making some decisions about what direction are we going in all these different ideas we're discussing.
So if people have questions about that, like basically what happens between now and the June meeting, and this is gonna happen for the rest of the process, but in June, you will see actual recommendations, ideas in writing for you all to look at. And we're gonna ask you to look at it beforehand. So we'll send them out to you a week in advance. I think it's gonna be hard to send more than a week in advance because the meeting is like June 1st. Coming up very soon. And so please watch after that, know that we're gonna ask you to look at all of those things that we send you and come to the meeting ready to say, here's what I think about them, here's some edits, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Does that make sense? What questions do people have? Are there any questions online? Taylor, no? Okay. So I think we can go to the next slide. Are you advancing, Grace?
I can.
Would you, please? So there's, so, yes. Okay.
Let's go to the next one.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect. So do you wanna just, so basically we talked about this at the beginning of the meeting. This is just reiterating in June, we're gonna start considering draft recommendations, particularly on phasing, what's required of whom, exemptions. And then
Let's add that last part though. So you see how we also say that we might need to talk about adjusting our task force timeline. So as I said from the very beginning, we set a pretty aggressive timeline, the idea that we would have a nice set of recommendations ready to share with the public by the end of July, so we can have public comment in August. We're gonna see how we do in June, right? So between now and the next meeting, we'll see how many recommendations we actually get drafted. We'll see how we do when we get through that meeting. Maybe we have 3 recommendations and one of them so contentious, it takes all 3 hours. Who knows? So I'm leaving it open that we may need an extra month. We'll see. We may not. I can't predict it, but we're gonna check in on that.
Would we add August or would we add October?
We're gonna have to wait and see. We're gonna be open on that.
one of the things, at this point, the city was thinking the month of August, so between, there's a July meeting, September meeting, the city was thinking the month of August would be public engagement. So in order to do that public engagement, you all would need a set of draft recommendations to share with the public. They don't have to be obviously super detailed, they just need to be high level, but, so that's why in June, we're gonna check back in with you all and say, are you ready after the July meeting, which will include looking at signage recommendation to go to public. Otherwise, we're pushing back. Yeah.
When you say draft recommendations, do you mean only the ordinance part, or is all of it going to be? Okay.
It can be all of it. I think that's a deliberation we get to have though, right? So, let's check on it in June and see how we're doing. Yeah. But I think that, personally, I would think that if we don't share both types of recommendations, the public's gonna have the same questions that you already have, so probably need to be commented.
Yeah. And note that in July is when we're proposing to get into signage, education, communication. And that work group, those of you signed up for that work group and any others who might want to, will be meeting a month ahead of time to help frame that meeting. Good? Okay, so we have one more slide. What concrete next step? Yeah.
I'm sorry, this about the timing, because Councilmember Clark and I were saying that he'll be a citizen by the time, I mean, he still is, but off council. But that made me think about, if we finalize recommendations in September, then that is, we have a new class of council, so at least 5 new members. But on top of that, September, now we're in budget season.
No, you don't need to worry about that yet, because the way this is going to work, do I even have that on that slide? No, I don't think it. The task force finishes its recommendations, then it has to go to city staff. I don't know how fast we're gonna actually write ordinance that gets submitted to council. So you could be looking at another month, 2 months, so we know, so no one's going to council in September with an actual ordinance. I don't think there's any way we would have draft language done.
I just know those 5 people will be overwhelmed in September, and then with budget season and all the.
Yeah.
the
We're not gonna be there.
documentation of,
Thank you for calling
No,
out.
I predicted it would be late fall, that would be like November would probably be at best when we would have actual ordinance language before council.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll be coming to open public comment in September.
Yeah, so the concrete next step, great news, just yesterday, I got another space, which allegedly has a working owl. Maybe we'll get there 2 hours ahead of time instead of 1, make sure it's set up, but the Denver Foundation apparently has all new space. And they've invited us to meet there, so we'll again be hybrid, and we've already talked about, what we're gonna be doing in that meeting. Homework, the work groups are gonna continue meeting. One thing I'd like to point out though, we need to know that all of you here, you represent a lot of people. We need to know that you're talking to them. And if you're not, let us help you. So you're representing small businesses and restaurants, right? Like you're talking to your restaurant association. I know Stephen, who couldn't be here today with BOMA, he sent out a survey to his members on our behalf, asking for cost data. So I know that he's able to engage them in that way. But if you're not feeling like you have people outside of here who you can talk to ensure that you're really representing their point of view, please let us know and we will be here to help. So for example, you know, Marguerite, you got a lot on your shoulders there representing every single apartment dweller in the city. You know, as I talked about at the beginning, OSCI has already recommended that we do a focus group or a couple of focus groups just with people who live in affordable housing. We can do even more of that for different constituencies. So if you're not working your network and you have one, please start working with them. And if you need our assistance in thinking about how to do that, please just come to us anytime and let us know how we can help.
And I think, I mean, like what Stephen did, I think it should be a simple survey on a Google form that goes back to you, that gives you some data to bring into it, as a member, but that the city can help you back.
Well, I think it would be helpful if we did that, if we did more of that too, once we had some draft recommendations on how this is gonna impact folks. I know there'll be a public comment period, but I was under the impression that we weren't supposed to send too much stuff out to our folks because they might think that they can change it.
Well, it all depends on how you communicate it, right? I mean, if even if you have a monthly newsletter to say, or a blurb in your newsletter that says that you are on this task force and here's what it's talking about, that is still at least a level of engagement that you're letting them know things are happening. Plus, don't forget, we do it, we're a little slow at times, but we do get all of the information from these meetings on our website. You can be directing your constituents or your network to that. So we put the agenda. When Ryan and her team completes a summary, we put the meeting summary on it. These PowerPoints, that's all there too. So you can always be directing people there, and that counts.
And also when there is the public engagement period, I think that's the times that the city also is going to be working with you all to help get the word out about, you know, workshops or focus groups or whatever it is to your community. Yeah.
No, it's more like all right, so the last thing I want to mention, know that within a week of this meeting is my goal to send you a summary email with all these documents. And so Clinton, it has offered a date for a tour of A1. Irwin also gave us dates for waste management. And I think Greg has at least one more tour of DAS on the schedule. All of that will be in the email. Or we're just gonna send out, I think you might actually be sending out meeting holds, and then people, like a meeting hold for your tour, and if people wanna select it or wanna say it, they just reply yes. If they don't, they decline, and that way you'll know about your head count, right?
Whichever works best for everyone.
Yeah, so we'll figure that out offline and we'll get that out to everybody. Yes,
Could I be included in that with a proxy?
of course.
You're trying to get the A1.
Okay.
And just to reiterate about the work groups, so tomorrow afternoon, hopefully by the close of business, we're gonna be sending you all several doodle polls for the work group meeting. So there are 4 work groups that will be meeting over the next month: licensing, building, C&D, and equity. And so we'll send you doodle polls, and you can sign up if you signed up for that work group or not. Please respond to the doodle poll with your availability, and then we'll schedule those early next week. We're hoping the work groups will meet in the next 10 days or so to just keep moving while it's fresh. And just, yeah, encourage all of you to attend whatever one you want. You're able to. Any other questions, comments before we close? Ryan?
A comment is to go on these tours. It really completes the whole picture. And I think I've seen a recycling facility, I've seen a dump or a landfill. Go to them and see them for yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. Anna?
I've been waiting for a permit to land, but we just got a demolition permit that we're gonna deconstruct the house in the center, so I'll invite everyone to come see that project.
That's awesome. That's great. Okay. All right, and thank you for the patience with the technology and the AP and
Thanks, everybody online.
thank you for your patience. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.